I think when we're thinking about the need for a public inquiry into the foster care scandal, one of the driving factors from me from day one has been the fact that children have been collateral damage in this process. So, I guess the starting point for me is to talk about how I came to be so passionately involved in resolving these issues. Back in 2016, 2017, when I was a foster carer for my local authority, I was basically army volunteered by my fellow foster carers into being the local union rep. And one morning we were having a social gathering breakfast in a pub, and a foster carer came up to me and said, "Oh, are you our union rep now? I need your help." And I'm not going to lie, this foster carer started telling me a story that I actually thought she was bonkers. My legal brain was like, that cannot possibly have happened. It just didn't make any sense. So anyway, I said, give me the file and I'll take it where I happen to be going away for a few days with my own foster children and birth children, and I'll read the file. And I was just astonished. It was just unbelievably poor, inadequate investigation, and it was clearly a retaliatory bullying action, and I was quite flawed. So I did get involved, and we had a really good service manager at the time, a guy called Gareth, and he was really on board with the fact that the investigation had been really poor. There was a lot of injustice towards the foster carers and the children, and he was keen to put it right. So ultimately, we did end up getting a substantiated ruling overturned and an apology from the Assistant Director of Children's Services to the foster carers. The things that kind of struck me in that particular process, as it was the first time I'd come across it, was the fact that the foster carers had put in a complaint via email about the children's social worker at 12:30 lunchtime. And at 4:30 that afternoon, the social worker turned up with another social worker and removed the children, said there were allegations. Now, those children had lived with those foster carers for around 10 years. It was the only life they'd known. One of them had learning difficulties, and she was actually off sick in her pajamas that day, and they just came and took them without notice. They didn't get the belongings back for 5 months, and the children will have had no explanation. It would To them, it would have just been these people that we thought were our parents don't want us anymore. We must be too naughty. We must be too much, and they never went back, and they never get to have an explanation. And that's all. That really stuck with me, as well as the injustice to the foster carers who were clearly quite traumatized by what they've been through. Just the thought of those children who were ripped away from a loving home, and the trauma, the rejection, the feelings of, inadequacy that they would and shame that they would be left with, that's lifelong harm. And when we got to breaking down what the case was about, it was things like the foster carer had emotionally abused the children allegedly because she'd used a professional word in a report. Now, those children, it wasn't an inappropriate word. It was a word that the social workers themselves had used, and she'd repeated it. And the fact was that the children, you couldn't be emotionally abusive to the children because they weren't going to see the report. Yes, admittedly, when they were adults, they might do a subject access request and get the report. But even then, it wasn't inappropriate, and it was language that was being used by the social workers. It was just this idea that the foster carer wasn't allowed to use professional language, which was utterly bizarre. And one of the other supposed allegations was that the foster carer had breached confidentiality by using the child's full first name instead of just their initial, in a response to an email in which the social worker who removed the children had literally used every detail under the sun about the child: first name, surname, date of birth, all of it. And the response from the management had been, we're not here to discuss what the social worker's done, we're here to talk about you. So those were clearly not evidence of child abuse that would justify children who've lived in a home for 10 years being, so awfully and abruptly removed in the pajamas when they weren't well. That was the first thing. And then when I actually got down to looking at the decision-making process, I explained to the service manager, Gareth, who kind of got exactly what I was saying. I gave an analogy that one of the substantiated decisions, the decision to substantiate the allegation, which was the one about using professional language in a report. So they said, blah, blah, or let's say Mrs. Smith, made up name, used a professional word in a report. And although we've decided that this didn't constitute emotional abuse because the child's not going to read it, she did, however, leave the children in the conservatory and go and answer the phone. So this allegation is substantiated, and that is literally word for word what the report said. So I said in the meeting with Gareth, the service manager, that is literally like I've been accused of shoplifting in Tesco. We've produced the CCTV, and clearly there's evidence that I didn't shoplift, I paid. Being taken to court and the judge saying, yeah, the evidence shows you didn't shoplift, but I'm finding you guilty anyway because you forgot to pay your TV license on time. And that was the level of incompetence and malice in that investigation that had led to that substantiated record that can cause immeasurable harm to a person's life, career. And, that in itself was wrong. And that bit we did correct. But the thing that always stuck with me was that there was no fixing the injustice for those children. They'd already been moved. They were long gone. They were never told. They were never told that this had been a completely unfair process and that your foster carers did want you. You shouldn't have been moved. And that in itself, to me, is abuse. That's emotional abuse. And that's kind of been the inspiration for this whole journey of trying to clean up the system and for pushing for a public inquiry. So, a few things from that first experience. Obviously, having a supportive service manager who was keen to correct injustice and put things right, that inspired me to really go with this journey because there are good people out there. There are people who want things done properly, working in local authorities. And I guess a bit naively, I assumed it would always be right like that, but clearly it isn't always like that. But, I think for my first experience to be that good, it really did inspire me to continue with the journey. So that's one point to make. Also, I naively thought at the time that it was a problem with our local authority, which was having lots of problems and did end up getting inadequate Ofsteds and becoming a children's trust, but they are fortunately on a good journey now. But I naively thought it was a localised problem until I was offered the vice chair role of a national foster care union and started dealing with foster carers all over the UK. And at this point, I realised, like, what I'd seen on that local level was actually a UK-wide problem, and that children. I mean, I can't tell you how many sleepless nights I've had over the years of hearing of children being dragged, kicking and screaming from loving homes, and knowing that those removals were not remotely justified. And knowing that the harm that that was doing to those children that was so unnecessary. And that's been part of the journey. But also just, in some more of these episodes, we'll talk about some of the harm to foster carers, people who've attempted suicide, some sadly who've been successful, some that we've found in time. People have lost their homes, their marriages, the teaching jobs, nursing jobs, all those careers that have been destroyed in a way that is completely unjust. And I think when we started going to the all party parliamentary groups back in 2017-18, there was an increasing number of foster carers coming forward talking about their stories. But at that time, they were just stories. And just like when that first foster carer came to me in at that breakfast and told me her story, unless you've seen the evidence and you've really got into the subject matter, you just think it can't possibly be true. This cannot be happening. This is so wild out there, far fetched that public servants would be behaving in this manner. It can't be right. And I think that's kind of to an extent where we were at. So Norman Lamb had, when he was an MP, he had represented some of or supported some of his foster carers in Norfolk, and he'd seen it firsthand, and he did believe it, and he called it financial mismanagement and abuse of power was his description of it. So there are MPs that know, but I think from my perspective, it was a case of we've got to do more than let people tell the stories. We have to start justifying and getting almost the rubber stamp on those stories to show that someone independent has investigated and yes, this horror story, this thing that you cannot honestly believe is happening, is really happening. So we started following processes to get things to the local government ombudsman and get rulings on those score. We've had court cases where we've got rulings, Social Work England, all of those different processes to get someone independent to look at all the evidence that we've gathered via subject access request, via the notes and the information the foster carers have, to go, yeah, this is true, this is wrong, and this happened. And it's taken a few years to really build that body of evidence, but I do believe that's where we're at. And we're now in a position, a much stronger position, to really say this has got to be dealt with. It's got to be dealt with for all the lives that have been ruined in terms of the adults who put themselves forward to be foster carers in good faith, who were utterly oblivious to the harm that they could suffer because of it. And for the children like that very first case I dealt with where they'd been ripped away from the home of 10 years in the pajamas when they were off sick from school. And, that's still, that was 2017 that I heard about that, and it still bothers me now. And I just think part of this process has got to be those children deserve to be told the truth. They deserve to be found and they deserve to be told you were loved, you were wanted, we didn't want you to go. That wrong has to be put right because there are so many children around the UK who are still suffering that emotional harm.